A quick note before we get started today. Leah and I are at DC Podfest, and thanks to Wildfire Radio, we recorded this episode in their mobile studio.
You're listening to the Author Inside You podcast, a weekly podcast designed to motivate you to finish writing a book, choose a publisher, and have your work build an audience. Keep listening if you're looking to get propelled into the next chapter of your life. And now, it's the Author Inside You podcast with your host, Leah and Matt Rafferty.
Hello, and welcome to the Author Inside You podcast. I'm Matt Rafferty.
And I'm Leah Rafferty.
Joining us today is Emily Prokop, author of The Story Behind, The Extraordinary History Behind Ordinary Objects. Emily is a journalist who has worked in newspapers and magazines and has a lifelong love of trivia and is the host of The Story Behind podcast. Welcome, Emily. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Well, Emily, how did you get the idea to start writing a book?
You know, it wasn't even my idea, and I had always wanted to write a book. I wanted to be a writer growing up. That was always something I did. I wrote in journals. I thought that I was going to write the great American novel. I was an English major and then switched it to journalism because I wasn't great at reading books that other people assigned to me. So I was like, well, journalism, that's all writing. Okay, I'll just do that. And when I started my podcast years later, I didn't think that it would become a book, even though I was scripting every episode. But a publisher reached out to me and said, we really like the content of your podcast. It's a short history podcast. It's 5 to 10 minutes. And she said, these would make great chapters. Have you thought about turning your episodes into books? And I was like, I had no idea. I didn't even think of that. How did I not think of that?
So just out of the blue, they wrote to you?
It was out of the blue. I did a lot of research on them to make sure this wasn't... Because as podcasters, as soon as you put your email address anywhere on the web,
sure,
people come and spam you. So I did a lot of research. I got to talk to them on the phone. They were very much on the up and up, and they were upfront with me. They're like, this is at no cost to you, because I know a lot of publishers might reach out and say, oh, well, if you pay us this much, we can publish your book. And as long as there was no upfront cost to me, I just have to write a book. Oh, okay, great. I already had the episodes written, but I also wanted to write chapters that listeners hadn't heard before, because I already knew that they were going to buy the book. And why would they buy a book of 50 chapters of episodes of podcasts that they had already listened to? So I wanted to make sure that I had a nice mix of episodes. So I think I had 30 chapters that were episodes that I just added more to as well. So if people wanted to reread it, they may get something new out of it. But I also had 20 chapters that weren't episodes of the podcast. And I wanted to make sure that the readers also could see that, oh, I really like reading this. Oh, I can listen to her podcast. I can get this once a week on my podcatcher. That's fantastic.
Very cool. Wait, congratulations. I mean, how many people can say, oh, the publishers came to me? I mean, that's pretty cool. So, huge deal.
Very cool.
So, was the process difficult for you, though? Did it scare you at all, or...
It did. I weirdly put off thinking about it much longer than I should have. So what I tell people now who are thinking about turning their podcast into a book, I'm like, okay, already keep that in your head when you're doing the podcast, so that you can think, I may want to turn this podcast that I'm doing into a book, and I can structure the podcast and my script and the show notes afterwards for turning it into a book that somebody else is going to want to read, and not just a transcript of he said this and she said this.
Mm-hmm. Did you come up with graphics or photos for each chapter?
I didn't. And actually, my publisher was really great. They got on the phone with me and they said, so what are you thinking? I'm like, I don't know. Tell me what I'm thinking. And they were really supportive. And they're like, well, how do you envision it? When we first said, we want you to write a book, did you envision anything? And I told them, I'd love to have graphics of everything that I'm talking about in there, whether they're drawings or whether they're pictures. And they were wonderful about it, and they threw them in. They did the work for me. I had one complaint, actually. This is very funny. I had somebody reach out and say, just so you know, I don't want to correct you on your book, but you talk about the revolver, and they used a picture of a pistol. And I'm like, I don't know the difference. It's a gun. I'm so sorry. I have nothing to do with this. I'm sorry.
So were there any copyright issues? Like if you did something, like I listened to your latest episode on Boston Baked Beans. Mm-hmm. So if there's a brand name Boston Baked Beans or Play-Doh or Kleenex, was there any problem?
No, I asked them about that too. And they said brand names love the publicity of being in books, unless you're talking disparagingly about them. So I had to think about that when I was writing and say, are they going to be mad at me if I bring this up? But I tried not to edit it. And I know I'm a journalist and I should be doing the deep dives, but I wasn't comfortable doing gotcha journalism on a book that's fun and, exciting for people.
And how long was the process from the time they called you until the time you had to have the final?
I had 6 months. I had from December to June, and I put off a lot of it until maybe 6 weeks before. And the big thing that held me up, actually, was structuring it, trying to figure out how I was going to turn my podcast into chapters that people would want to read, because I didn't just want a wall of text, because I'm not great with a wall of text. So it was nice to be able to reach out to my publisher and say, hey, do you mind if I do these little breakout boxes? Or do you mind if I do, at the end, these 3 bullet points, so that if this chapter that was maybe 1,000 words was too long and they just wanted even more bite-sized nuggets of information, I could put that at the end. They said, no, that's great. And they even said, we picture your book as a boutique book where we can sell it to these cute little stores. Like, they pictured it in Urban Outfitters near the register, where people just kind of pick it up while they're in line. They can read part of a chapter and already get engrossed in it and be like, oh, I want to buy this book.
Right, sure. I mean, that's nice to be able to pick up a book and pick it up right in the middle of the book, get something, a cool story, and then say, who would like this? I'm going to buy him a copy for Christmas, right? Mm-hmm. So that's very cool. So what are you doing to promote the book?
My publisher was really good about sending me a packet of information about, here are the keywords we want you to use. These are the same keywords that Amazon's going to assign to your book, or that we're going to assign to your book in Amazon. Make sure you're using these keywords in your tweets, in your Instagram. People are going to associate that. They may not remember how to spell Emily Prokop, but they may be able to look up the story behind, what did she talk about? History? She talked about science. She talked about wars. Like, I have those 7 keywords just programmed into my brain at this point. And that helped. The other thing was the fact that I had an audience. I asked them, can you, when you get your copy, can you hold it up? I'd love to see a picture of it. Can I repost it? I mean, they gave me my content for my social media just by doing that, and me being able to repost it and say, this is somebody with my book, because I'm sure they're sick of seeing my face holding up my own book.
So it sounds like it was a pretty easy process for you.
It was, but it wasn't, because there was a lot of imposter syndrome going on that really hampered a lot of it. It was this tiny voice inside of me of just, you can't do this. Who are you to write this book? Who do you think you are? You're taking other people's research and you're just rewriting it for yourself. And my husband, I had to break down to him and be like, I have this voice, and why am I doing it? All my words are stupid. And it's 3 days before my deadline. I'm like, I'm ready to delete the whole thing. And he had to sit me down and be like, who has said that to you? And I'm like, well, me. And he's like, okay, well, you're not the best judge of character right now of yourself. So he's like, has anybody said that to you? What have they said to you? They're supporting you. They can't wait to buy your book. They can't wait for you to talk about it on your podcast. Why are you thinking this? And I'm like, I know you're right, but it's really hard. And he's like, just do it. Just get through it. It's fine. As soon as you get that deadline, then you don't have to think about it until 3 months when it comes out. I'm like, okay, all right, fine, I'll go back and write my book.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I think that there are a lot of people who have ideas in their head, or even maybe write them, but don't publish, don't go any farther like me, because the imposter, like, who am I? You're right. Yeah. But some people have no problem. They're just confident. So thank you for sharing that, because I think that's what a lot of people need to hear. You're not alone. Mm-hmm. You can do this. And why can't, if someone else can do it, why can't you?
Right.
Right? I mean, let's just all help each other. And so thank you for sharing that. I think people need to hear that.
Yeah, and I think one of the best things I did was I had a podcast episode coming out that week, probably that day. And I was just, usually I would do the story behind something, but this time I was like, listen, here's a book update. Here's what I'm going through. I'm going to be point blank with you. Sorry, there's no real episode. I'm going through imposter syndrome. I'm freaking out. I don't know if I'm going to get this book done. And all of a sudden, I had listeners reach out to me that I never heard before say, we can't wait to read this book. And they kind of reassured me, and I was able to reach out. And that's something that was also scary for me.
So when you posted that podcast about the imposter syndrome, the feedback was great from your audience?
Yeah, and I had heard from listeners that I had never heard from before in the two years of doing the show. And I'm like, wait, who are you? Where did you come from? And they had already gotten to know me from the podcast, from social media, that they felt familiar enough to say, you know what, even though I usually listen to this podcast while I'm driving and I can't do it, I'm going to put it in my head for later that I'm going to reach out and let her know that it's okay. And that was really great to have. And I know a lot of authors would love to have that audience built in before they wrote a book. So one of the things that my publisher said from the very beginning, start a mailing list, get to know your audience, because they're going to be your launch team. Whether or not you want them to be, they're going to be your launch team.
What are you doing to market your book?
So a lot of it's online marketing. The packet that I got from my publisher was like, make sure you're posting 1 to 3 times a day. So for me, I've had to...
A day?
I know. I'm barely online that much. I get social media overload a lot. So I schedule a post. It's very nice to be able to schedule posts, and especially when somebody else gets the book, I ask them, hey, can you take a picture? Can I repost it? Can I talk about you in my email newsletter that I barely send out because I did not want an email list, but I know it's so important to have. And of course, it gives people instant access to buy more from you because you can just put the links in there, and there's a better open rate than necessarily clicking through Facebook and trying to scroll and scroll and scroll. I'm trying to think of how else I'm marketing it. My publisher is awesome about... They knew to go to Europe because apparently trivia books are really big in Europe. And they knew anything related to trivia. They've said, oh, we were in France the other day. We said we have a trivia book. And they were like, oh, yep, yeah, we want that.
Wow. So have you ever thought about speaking to like middle school or high school students?
Well, it's funny. My book, I didn't even realize actually from my podcast that teachers liked my podcast and they would use it to teach storytelling to students because it's 5 to 10 minutes. It's very quick to show them. This is how you do a narrative. This is how you go from the beginning to the end and wrap it up in a nice little bow. And it's great because I was able to connect with Chris Nessie, who does House of Ed Tech, and he does a lot of mixing podcasting and education together with students. So it's really cool to think about, wow, these kids who are listening to my podcast in class, they're actually hearing a commercial for my book in there. And that's another thing I should have mentioned about marketing is I have a podcast that every episode I mention the book. And I feel weird after a while, but my audience is used to it. They're like, we know she has a book. I don't think they've gotten sick of it yet. So...
Right, but it's just like watching any TV show and you see a commercial for Sprint every time you watch Modern Family.
Yes.
You're okay with it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's part of the show.
Yeah, and I still love listeners who are just like, oh, you wrote a book based on this? I was like, where have you been? And I find out that they let my podcast build up in their podcast app and then binge listen to it. So they're like, oh, wow, we heard you from writing the book to halfway through to your little breakdown there. And then coming out with the book. So that was really cool to binge listen to.
And did you have a launch party?
I didn't. Again, right before the book came out, I had another bout of imposter syndrome. And the day it was released, I was in bed the whole time. I was like, just bring me Taco Bell and my cat. I just can't deal. I can't deal with this because I know I'm supposed to be on. And my husband, again, he's just like, what are you thinking is going to happen? Do you think people are going to come at you and say, you wrote this book, how dare, who are you? Like, why? And I'm like, no, but I don't even want it. He's like, do you want me to check your social media? I'm like, yes. And he's looking through, he's like, congratulations, we can't wait, we got the book. I'm like, okay.
Well, great, that's wonderful. Well, you have a great story. Yeah. Your story alone is a book. It's very nice.
So do you have any other advice for people who are thinking about writing a book or in the process of getting started writing a book?
Listen to podcasts about books and book marketing. I can recommend this one. I can recommend the Book Marketing Show, The Creative Pen. When you're driving, just always think about it. And always, when you're thinking about content, think of how can I turn this into a book and write it down. It's not always easy. I used my Siri at the time a lot and be like, remind me of this. I want to add this to the book.
Mm-hmm. But you're right, because when you're driving, you come up with ideas that you don't when you're just sitting there in front of your laptop.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Or when you're in the shower.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really nice when Siri had you can voice activate her if you just say, hey, Siri. So a lot of my hey, Siri messages back to me are just like from the shower. I'm just, hey, remind me to buy cat food.
Yeah. And where can our listeners purchase your book?
So I have it on the storybehindpodcast.com. You can click the link that says book, and that will bring you to the link on Amazon, the link on Barnes & Noble. It's available on those platforms as well. There are a lot of the story behind books, so if you can remember my name, it's easier to search that way. The Story Behind by Emily Prokop, and that's Prokop. I had to think about that. Yeah. It's my husband's name. So.
Right. And how can our listeners get in touch with you?
Again, you can go to my website, thestorybehindpodcast.com, or you can go on Twitter, Instagram. Everything is at storybehindpod.
Excellent. Thanks, Emily.
Yeah.
And thanks to Wildfire Radio for helping us out today, and to DC Podfest. It was great being here.
And to your brother Ed, who's a special guest today.
I know. I had a friend.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Author Inside You podcast with your host, Leah and Matt Rafferty.